Hello everyone, this is PK Entertainment and we're back again, and here now we have another video for you, and this will be a full-on spoiler review for The Batman. Now you can check out my non-spoiler review of the movie and several other videos around the movie itself within the channel, and I'll leave some links within the description. Now this won't be a chronological breakdown of the movie, but it'll be much more of a free discussion, highlighting more in detail what I felt worked most and what I felt didn't work as well within the movie. So this is your final warning now. All spoilers going ahead for this film. If you haven't yet seen it, you want to click off now, watch my other coverage of the videos, watch the movie, and then come back to this overall review. So first off, we go ahead with the opening of the film, where essentially Bruce is narrating his various activities as the Batman, because we haven't really seen a live action movie where Bruce Wayne or Batman is in narration. Now it didn't really affect the movie in any way, shape or form. It's only at the beginning of the movie and I think near the end of the movie as well, so I think that was a good choice overall. It kind of deflates the suspense if the character is narrating throughout all of the whole movie, because you know they're going to make it throughout the story because they're telling the tale. So it didn't really affect it too much. It was just a unique opening towards the movie. Now, I referenced an early scene that Bruce has with Alfred where he comes back from his activities as Batman and they're having a discussion, and basically Alfred is telling him that he can't go on like this any longer, and Bruce retorts back to him that basically that he's not his father and he's not his guardian, and we get some references as well towards his parents. Now this scene alone reminded me so much of the scene with Batman Begins. I believe it's 2/3 of the way through, where Bruce is essentially full on within his Batman role now, and Alfred is trying to calm him down and trying to have him be more involved as Bruce Wayne as opposed to Batman. So it just reminded me overall with this scene in particular from Batman Begins. But we move on from there, and I think one element that a lot of people liked and I liked too was that Batman was very much working in tandem a lot with Gordon throughout all of the detective angles in terms of searching the cases, looking at all the evidence for all the crime scenes, and this was one of the best elements of the movie, and it really sticks with this partnership between them for the most part, certainly towards the last quarter of the film I would say. And I think there's a good rapport between both Jeffrey Wright and Robert Pattinson, and I think it's good to see multiple scenes where they're at various buildings and alleyways and they're meeting up every now and again. For the most part, we normally associate Bruce and Gordon meeting up amongst the rooftops whenever he shows the bat signal, but this movie had them really much more active on the streets and on the prowl and on the hunt, and I just think that was a good way of showing how good the pairing of them worked together. Now obviously this film established that they had been in harness in terms of crime fighting for around 2 years or so, so that was very well worked for the most part. I also liked the innovation of having video via contact lenses, and I don't believe we've previously seen that before within any superhero movie, I believe, let alone a Batman film. I think for the most part where we have the Marvel movies, they always have the very small earpieces so they can keep track of one another, but I don't believe we've had it where somebody's actually had a video link via contact lenses, and in many ways that was very smart of them, because that would make sense, because for Batman, the amount of crime scenes that he visits, the amount of villains that he encounters, it would make sense that he would record a lot of his activities, and what best way to do it rather than having a video link via contact lenses. So I liked that, and I also liked the way that Selina was using the eye lenses as well, when she had the pink wig and she had to go into the club to talk to the DA, and then as she was talking to the DA we saw all of the other corrupt officials within the nightclub, when we saw Falcone and we saw Oswald as well. So those were good moments between the two, and I think overall there was a good rapport, I think, between both Robert Pattinson and Selina. I didn't quite buy the love story between them both. They were just working together, and then all of a sudden she decides to kiss him, so that really wasn't developed well enough. Now I think Zoe Kravitz was a very good performance in this film. I don't think the character of Selina was quite as interesting as what she could have been. She was very much for the most part relying on Batman in terms of how he was helping her discover who killed her friend. As we all saw, the escort girl at the beginning of the movie was murdered, and that was really the driving motivation behind Selina trying to find out who had murdered her friend. I did like the funeral scene with the corrupt DA. If you remember, we saw this when Warner Brothers released this clip online a couple of weeks ago. Essentially we have it where I believe the superior officer of Commissioner Gordon, he had been killed by the Riddler on that video clip where the Riddler had fed him to the rats. And then this was the funeral scene afterwards. It began, of course, when Bruce was talking to the black woman campaigning for mayor, and then he sees the kid in the church, and then that's when the van drives in, and that's when we see the corrupt DA, and he has the bomb attached to him. We saw that with the earlier scene before when the Riddler managed to apprehend him within his car. And this was a very good shot scene, as we already saw online as well. But I just liked the scene afterwards when the DA was trapped and they managed to evacuate the church, and then Batman was talking to him on his own, and then he had to guess 3 riddles within the space of 2 minutes. And this was one of the sequences where they really did ramp up the tension and the atmosphere that we saw throughout the entire movie. And we saw at the end when he couldn't guess all of the riddles in time, and then he explodes right in front of Batman, and that's when Batman is blown back. So just a very good scene overall. And I did actually like the following scene when Batman is then apprehended by the cops and he's taken to the police office. Now, when I saw this scene in the trailer, I was a bit confused. Batman would never get himself in a scenario where he's surrounded by policemen. Batman always has a way out. He always has a tendency to keep himself at a certain distance. Of course, he'll keep in close contact with Gordon, but he always makes sure that he's got some sort of exit point. So I did wonder how this scene would play out, but obviously he's trapped within the police cell. This was another clip that they released online when Batman punched Commissioner Gordon, and we were all wondering, well, how does that happen? But actually they were kind of working it together. So Gordon handed Batman the keys in order for Batman to be able to escape the police headquarters. We then go on to what was probably the best action sequence throughout the entire movie, and that indeed was the car chase. So essentially they, I believe, had tracked down one of these subordinates within Falcone's group, and then there was a buyout to be staged within the street, and then Oswald Cobblepot appeared, and then that's when Batman infiltrated them. And I believe Batman might be shot in this scene, and then he somehow recovers, and then that's when he chases Oswald Cobblepot. And yeah, this was a very frenetic, a very hectic scene overall in terms of the car. Now I would admit I haven't been impressed by the design of the car. It did look a lot better in live action. It looked a lot more physical, it looked a lot more stronger than indeed what we saw from the trailers. I'm very much old school. I still want the classic design of the Batmobile. I want it to look like a bat. I want all of Batman's technology and accessories to very much resemble his design of his character and his costume. So that's why I'll always believe that the Tim Burton version of the Batmobile will reign supreme over anything we've seen ever since then. But yeah, this was a very exceptional car sequence. I think it did well because it really did throw you in terms of the driver's point of view, and we saw various crashes between all of the Batmobile and the various fans. And I did of course like that scene where Oswald thinks he's got away, and then we see the leaping car jumping through the flames, and that's when Oswald cars flip over. So that was a very good scene as well. Now there was one issue that I had, particularly with the presentation of Batman, and this is really where we talk about what defines iconic Batman. Now for me, one of the quintessential elements is that Batman is very much living in the shadows. He is very much of that ninja being or personality where he's able to infiltrate places without anybody seeing him. Now of course the tone and the intent of this film was to present far more of a realistic interpretation. So we had a lot of scenes where Batman was just walking into buildings, and there was this one scene where of course he has to try and get into a club, and then he just walks up to the bouncers and asks them to walk into the club. They reject him, and then that Batman just beats his way through the door and starts beating everybody, and then that's when he meets Oswald, I believe, for the first time. Now again, this is where your point of preference will differ, because if you were very much into this whole realistic tone, then you would love the fact that Batman can't get himself out of every situation. But I think it just took away from the fact that Batman wouldn't just walk into a club, right? Batman would sneak into it somehow. He would find some way to infiltrate the club without walking into the entrance, and then he would pop up behind someone, and you would think, well, how did Batman enter that place? But then that's the magic of Batman, that's the mystery of Batman. Okay, that's really where you almost give him a sense that he has superpowers, even though he hasn't got any superpowers. The fact that he can get in and out of tight situations, and it always leaves you open to question how he can do so. So I didn't like the fact that they were really kind of stripping him down, where he was walking into clubs and walking into buildings everywhere. Now I know the tendency is to favour much more of somebody who's more flawed and fallible, but again, it just took away, I think, the aura and the mystery of the character. We then go on to, I think, one of the main flaws throughout this film, and that's how it really lost its narrative focus in the second half of the movie. Now, for the first part of the movie, it is very much of that serial killer narrative, where we have, again, as I mentioned before, Batman and Jim Gordon. They're on the hunt for the Riddler as he commits his various crimes, and this is where the film really had much more of that claustrophobic, very much more of a lower scale feeling, and that was, I think, the intent of the original plot. But then we shift halfway through to focusing far more on Selina Kyle and the plot, again, to gain revenge for what happened to her friend. And then we focus a lot more on the Falcone narrative and the connection to the criminal organization, and how we find out that all of the police and the lawyers and the district attorneys, they're all connected. Again, this is going back to that typical narrative that we've seen before with Batman Begins. There was a very similar scene, if you remember, when Bruce Wayne goes to see Falcone, and we see all of the corrupt officials and politicians all around in the same bar at the time. So this is very similar, but the problem is that the tone of the film shifted far more into much more of a expansive police procedural or a criminal drama. We'd almost forgotten about who the Riddler was. Now they tried to tie it together because essentially what happened was that Riddler's father was an investigative journalist known as Thomas Elliot, and we actually find out that Thomas and Martha Wayne, in terms of the history, Martha Wayne was actually a mental patient. Her actual name was Martha Arkham, I believe, and she spent a bit of time in the Arkham Asylum, and then Thomas reconnected with her, and that's when they married as Thomas and Martha Wayne. Thomas Elliot discovered Martha's past, and then that's when Thomas Wayne had tried to pay him off, but Thomas Elliot resisted. So that's when Thomas Wayne went to Falcone to try and sort the business out, and then that's when Falcone killed Thomas Elliot. Thomas Wayne found out what Falcone had done. He was going to go to the police about it. Falcone found out what Thomas Wayne was going to do, and that's when he had Thomas killed. So in a roundabout way, they were trying to establish the main reason for Riddler killing all of these people, but it really got muddled because, as I said before, we just put a lot more emphasis in Bruce trying to discover the true origins of his parents, and it just becomes almost a different movie halfway through. And this is one of the biggest reasons why I think the film was far too long than what it needed to be. They needed to just stick the focus on hunting down the Riddler, and I think you would have had an almost very good to great 1.5 to maybe 2 hour movie. But because we're expanding far more into the criminal organization and they're trying to develop all of these backstories and these character motivations, it just stretched the movie out, and it didn't meander. I mean, I was never bored at this stage, but it just wasn't as invigorating as the whole Riddler subplot. And trying to tie everything together again, it just was a bit of a drain at this point, and you could start to feel the weight of the movie's runtime. And another major mistake was having the whole reveal when Riddler showed a message or video clip on a news report. Now, this is a classic case of telling people something rather than showing them something. Now, I think had this movie stuck to it being far more of a smaller scale, where we had far more of an intimate climax between both the Riddler and Batman, and then this is when the Riddler revealed who his true identity was, I think that would have had far more weight and significant impact. We had been building this whole trail of somewhat of a personal connection between all of the clues and the messages that Riddler was sending Batman, and of course as an audience you're wondering, well, why is he connected to him? And again, this was allusions to what I mentioned in my previous coverage, that this wasn't really the classic Riddler. This was much more of a hybrid of the Riddler and the Hush villain. And if you know anything about the Hush villain, he was of course Thomas Elliot, and he had some sort of personal connection between Bruce Wayne when they were younger, and that's how they built up the emotional resonance between the two. They didn't quite do that in this movie, and I think they should have done. It was a big mistake not to, and like I said, it would have carried a far more impact had they had that reveal between a final confrontation between the Riddler and Batman rather than just showing it in a news report. And as I mentioned in my non-spoiler review, I wasn't a fan of this interpretation of the Riddler. It kind of really isn't the Riddler if you really think about it, in terms of everything from his costume and his helmet and his glasses. Now, I found some of the video scenes very comical when he's almost giggling and laughing as he holds up his victims, and again it just felt really out of touch with the tone of the film itself. Now, it wasn't as bad as Jim Carrey, as I mentioned in my non-spoiler review, but it was still really just overplayed by Dano, and this was happening all the way through, and particularly where we have the interrogation scene between Batman and the Riddler. Now, in the beginning there was very clever, because when the Riddler mentions Bruce Wayne and he's calling out Bruce Wayne's name again and again as Batman enters the interrogation room, you do think all of a sudden, wow, he actually knows who Bruce Wayne's identity is. And you can see this thought process going through Batman himself, and he's looking at all the cameras because he's realizing that the conversation is being recorded. So he's thinking to himself, is my identity being outed? But that wasn't the case, and I'm glad that wasn't the case, because that would have required a lot of explanation as to how exactly the Riddler found out who Batman's identity is. Now, again, if you go back to, I think in particularly the Hush comic book storyline and also the Hush animated movie as well, they do play into this more, where I do believe Thomas Elliot knows who Bruce is because he was tracking him at a very young age and was able to deduce over time that Bruce Wayne was indeed Batman. Now, they played it in a different dynamic here, because the whole motivation of the Riddler through killing all these victims was indeed to get back at Bruce Wayne, because obviously Bruce Wayne was the son of Thomas Wayne, who the Riddler felt was responsible for killing his father. So this whole elaborate plan around killing everybody was all to get Bruce. Bruce was meant to be the final victim, and this is what the Riddler says, that the one person I couldn't get was Bruce. You know, all of these privileged people, and I couldn't get the one that was the most privileged. So I kind of question that motivation, because he's doing all of this to get Bruce, when, if you think about it, when we see all of the events play out throughout the movie, he had multiple chances to kill Bruce. There was that one scene, if you remember, at the funeral where everybody's standing there at the church, and then we see a glimpse of the Riddler as he walks away before the van walks through or drives through the church. So if he really wanted to just kill Bruce, he could have got him multiple times throughout the story. Why does he have to do this whole elaborate plan of killing all the various individuals within Gotham? Now, they tried to establish it where the Riddler was very unhappy at the whole system within Gotham, at the whole corruption of Gotham, right? But this whole revelation at the end, it really felt at odds with what the Riddler was originally trying to do. So again, this was a failure of the film, because it wanted to build that emotional connection between the two characters, Riddler and Bruce Wayne, but I think it should have been brought in far earlier. And again, had we spent less time focusing on the Falcone aspect of the storyline and focusing far more on the Riddler and Batman storyline, I think we would have had more time to draw even more personal connection between the two characters. Now, I did mention before my non-spoiler review that I thought for the direction that he was given, Pattinson was good in the role, but he wasn't exceptional. I didn't really like the fact that this Bruce Wayne was really too vague in terms of his personality or charisma. You really could have felt that Bruce Wayne and Batman were indeed the same person. Now, I know they went for a different direction this time, that he didn't want to create the persona of that playboy billionaire that we normally associate so much with the Batman identity, but I think if you try and paint them as the same person, you lose that variance, you lose that contrast, you lose that interest in the personality. And I just feel we had no variance in terms of the Robert Pattinson Batman. Now, all of the scenes that he had with both Falcone, where Falcone tells him about his father, and also with Alfred later on within the hospital, these scenes just fell flat for me. They weren't bad scenes in particular, but again, I think because of Pattinson's lack of personality, this interpretation just still felt for me rather one note and one dimensional. So these scenes weren't quite as impactful as what they should have been, and to be honest with you, I think they should have been taken out, again, just to lessen the length of the whole movie itself. Now, we go on to the last act, and I think this is where the movie really threatened to lose itself, when we find out the whole culmination of Riddler's plan, when Batman goes to his apartment and he looks at all of his various devices and trappings and newspaper cuttings, and then he uncovers the floorboards where he sees the whole blueprint of the city, and it turns out that Riddler had all of these bombs mapped out all over the city. And this development really just came out of nowhere, and again, it felt so much like the climax within Dark Knight Rises. If you remember that scene where Bane blows up the stadium and then goes on to blow all of the bridges around Gotham City in order to disconnect it from the rest of the world. This is when we see Batman discovering Riddler's emails, and then we find out that he actually had a whole group of dedicated acolytes or disciples. I guess they were sympathizers to his ideology. All of a sudden, they all appear out of the woodwork, so he's been working with them in secret. You could have had a narrative where multiple people were taking the Riddler identity in order to kill all of the people, and that would have been far better, because as an audience, it would have kept us guessing as to who the Riddler was, and it would have been far more in keeping with the detective mystery that we saw particularly in the first half of the movie. But to have all of a sudden this whole group of supporters for the Riddler, it really was underdeveloped, and it needed far better setup. And again, for a movie that's 3 hours long, to throw in this development very much at the last minute without having any substantial setup is very much of a weakness of the film. How did Riddler exactly employ all of these people? And how much time did he take to develop this whole elaborate plan of setting all of these bombs throughout the city? So it was such a forced development towards the end, and really needed far more development. The movie itself really should have stayed on a mystery serial killer story arc, and that would have resulted in the film being roughly around 2 hours long. We then go on to the big action climax where we have Batman fighting all of Riddler's soldiers within the arena, and this really felt to me a lot like studio interference. Maybe they were worried about the somber tone throughout the first 2/3 of the film, and instructed Reeves to provide much more of a slam bang spectacle, because when we see Batman fighting everybody and all of these explosions everywhere, and he's swinging across the arena punching down all of these soldiers, there was that sequence where he was knocked down and he had to inject himself with morphine or adrenaline in order to save Catwoman, and he's beating down on that soldier, and then that's when Jim Gordon intervenes. And all of this felt like a really different movie. This felt much more like a typical action blockbuster, and again, I just think it was much more of the studio wanting to make sure that there was some sort of spectacular climax throughout the film. Now, I did like the visual shot that we saw from the trailers when we saw Batman using his flare in order to lead all of the trapped civilians out of the flooded arena. That was a very stunning visual shot, and that was good because in many ways that presented Batman much more in a heroic light. And I think, yes, by all means you can have Batman certainly in a far more darker story, but there has to be that heroism, there has to be that aspirational or inspirational element to the character as well. So I did like that sequence, and I also liked the following sequence at the end when we see Batman helping people out of the flooded areas very much in the daylight, and there was that one touching scene where the survivor is being carried away on a stretcher and she clings on to Batman, just acknowledging the fact that he's able to help all of these people out. So that was very good, and we get in the narration at the end essentially that Batman learns now that he can't just be in the shadows, he's got to be far more of the typical hero of the city. So that was very good in the sense that they are at least trying to acknowledge that Batman does recognise that he has to be far more of an open symbol towards the residents of Gotham City. And then we come on to the part that I had to mark the film down. We get a sequence where we see the Riddler in his cell where he's locked up now, and he's laughing at someone, and that somebody is laughing back at him. And when he looks across the cell and the way that this individual is laughing in the prison cell, all roads lead to yet again the Joker. And once again it just brings up that eternal problem that whenever we're dealing with Batman, they just can't let go of the Joker. We've seen this so many times through so many iterations now. The fact that Batman along with Spider-Man has the most extensive rogues gallery within all of comic book interpretations and comic book characters, we keep going back to the Joker again and again and again and again. Now, there's been no confirmation yet as a sequel. Now, I'm sure there will be a sequel because this film, no doubt, will be a huge box office success. But I just won't be happy if that sequel once again presents us as the Joker. We've seen the Joker so many times. If you actually think about it, we've almost had as many iterations of the Joker as what we've had with Batman, and certainly in the last 5 to 10 years. And I just think enough now. Let's stop using the Joker now. Let's start actually using other villains that we haven't seen before in live action. It's just very tired and it's just very cliched at this point, and I think will actually hurt this potential franchise if indeed we go back to using the Joker for the second film. And then we go on to the ending scene, which was fine enough when we see Batman and Selina both go in their separate ways on their motorbikes. So very well handled overall, and like I said, they were very much hinting that Batman has to be far more of the heroic personality, and then they both ride off together, and that's when the movie ends. So overall, as I said before, I think this is a very solid, technically crafted and very fine made movie, but for me it is in no way or any sense the greatest Batman movie ever. I appreciate that it does emphasise a lot more Batman in terms of his role within Gotham City. It emphasises far more on a detective aspect. It has that dark, gritty feel, but to be honest, all Batman films, apart from Batman and Robin, let's say, I've always had that dark, gritty feel. So again, I understand how it very much appeases a lot of what people were expecting throughout this film, but I think it's going to be one of those movies that when we look back on it, certainly in a couple of years after we've watched it, I think after all the hype and sensationalism dies down, I think people will revise it and say this is a fine movie. But for me, certainly it definitely wasn't as good as the Nolan films, and it definitely wasn't as good as the Burton films. Now, I'll probably provide a breakdown of what I deem are the best live action Batman movies, and I will include this entry within that listing, and that will be provided very shortly on the channel, so look out for that. So I'll talk about that more in depth. So overall, this film was just a very solid entry, very technically built over, but in no way, shape or form was it a masterpiece, and it definitely wasn't the greatest Batman live action film ever. So those are my overall thoughts and feelings and spoiler review for the Batman. Let me know what you think in the comments below. If you have any other further talking points that you'd like me to expand upon in further videos, then just drop me something within the comments and I will see if I can have further debate alongside those within the future. Please also hit and like those subscription and notification buttons so I can provide you with more high quality content like this in the future. But that's it for now. Take care of yourselves, stay safe distances, and I will see you very, very soon.